Hello and welcome to Featherlight Stories. One new story every Thursday and Sunday. Stories you can think about or talk about or feel inspired by, but stories that will always help you feel calm. My name is Cedric, and this is episode 10, The 1 Year King. In an ancient land, people were ruled by kings and queens. These rulers had all the power and only had to obey one strict, unchallengeable rule. After exactly 1 year, they had to leave their palace and spend the rest of their lives on an island that was just out of sight of the land's shores. This meant that no king, no queen was ever allowed to rule for longer than 1 year. Every year, the same spectacle took place. The king or queen mounted an elephant and rode out of the city under loud applause from all the citizens, after which the parade moved towards the sea, crossing many villages where the ruler also had a chance to say farewell to his subjects there. Then it was time to board a beautiful ship. Often a little bit of force was necessary to motivate the crying king or queen, and that ship then navigated towards the island where the king or queen was thanked for one last time, and the ship then returned with one empty chair. On one of the many return voyages, the captain of the ship spotted a man in the water. He was barely holding on to a piece of wood that looked like it used to be part of another ship once. The man was lifted out of the water, and since there weren't any dry clothes on board other than the robes of the previous king, the captain decided to offer these to the shivering person that was already thankful for receiving food and water. Once they arrived at port, people cheered for their new king, but the man refused and said he had done nothing to deserve such an honor. The captain of the ship explained him that it was only for 1 year and that it was pretty hard to find people who would accept to be king or queen. The man asked why, and the captain told him about the island. Upon hearing this, the man accepted. After all, he had already lost everything when his ship sunk, and since the kingship was offered to him, he figured he might as well make the best out of these people's generous offer. And so, the man became king. He was mounted on an elephant and paraded from village to village until he arrived in the big city, where he had to swear an oath, after which he entered the vast and breathtaking palace. Everything was covered in gold, in silver, and it was decorated with the most brilliant precious stones, gems, and diamonds. An army of servants was at his disposal, and the king could ask for anything and it would be his. At night, the king thought about how fortunate he had been to encounter the ship that saved him and how he would otherwise have been dead by now. This made him think about the oath he had sworn that day. A year from now, he would return to the sea and live on an island. He wondered about that island until he finally fell asleep. The next morning, a servant asked him if he preferred his breakfast in bed, in the dining hall, or on his private balcony, and what he wanted to eat. everything was available. The previous king had been a ferocious eater and demanded that everything had to be at his disposal whenever he asked for it. After 3 days, the new king visited the captain that had saved him and asked him to show him the island, the one he would call his home 362 days from now. The captain obeyed his king and showed him the island. It was much larger than he had expected, with mountains and vast forests and broad rivers flowing into the sea. There was no sign of any of the former kings or queens, so the new king asked if he could go on land. Of course, was the answer, and so it happened. The king, accompanied by servants and guards, set foot on the island's white beach and looked around. The forests were dense jungles, and he could hear wild animal sounds coming from them. Still, of the kings and queens that preceded him, there was no sign at all. So the new king asked if they could walk towards the jungle. The captain of the guard seemed worried about his king's safety, but with drawn weapons, guards formed a square around their king, and thus they walked closer towards the jungle. It was there that the new king spotted some skulls, one even wearing a crown. It was obvious to him now that none of his predecessors survived on this island, and shaken by this realization, he asked to be taken back to his palace. Immediately the guards and servants turned around, and later that day, the magnificent ship could be admired in its port again. The king, on their journey home, noticed how the villages were in poor shape. Houses had broken roofs, roads were often full of pits and holes, and, especially in the city, many beggars kneeled next to them. Curious to how this was possible, given the splendor he had seen around him so far, he asked the captain of his guard how it could be so. The captain replied that the last several rulers had been pretty greedy, and most of what was valuable had been carried off to the palace or other estates that had been built for and by them. The next day the king decreed that it was time to give back to the people what had been taken from them. He would start by feeding them. The masses cheered, but one of his advisors turned to him and addressed an important issue. Most of the food reserves had been depleted because the previous king organized extensive feasts, and for that, much of the wildlife had been exterminated. The king told him not to worry. He knew of a place with plenty of wildlife. In the month that followed, large hunting parties sailed towards the island, and not long after, the ferocious beasts that inhabited its jungles were delicious meat on the tables of even the poorest people. They ate and thanked their king. Again, the king spoke to his people and promised it was time to build them new houses. The masses cheered, but the king's advisor frowned. Unfortunately, most of the trees had been cut down to build the previous ruler's estates and new furniture. The king reassured his advisor. He knew a place with plenty of trees, a place where it was now safe to go into the woods. In the months that followed, workers, lots of workers, sailed to the island and cut down hundreds, no, thousands of trees, and they chopped the wood into planks. The king visited his workers and saw how they lived in tents and mosquito-infested huts, So he pointed at the planks and told them to build houses with them so that they could live there while they were working on the island. The workers did what their king had said. To make the transportation of wood easier, they built roads and even dug a canal. Farms were built and orchards were cultivated so that the workers could eat. In the 9th and 10th month, they had collected enough wood to build entire new villages, and the king was asked how to carry all the wood back. It seemed like a good idea to build more ships and use those to transport everything. The king said it, and the workers did it. In the 11th month, the ships were finished along with a whole new port. The workers had even built an enormous statue of their king to honor him and thank him for what he had accomplished. When the king saw it, he told them they should have placed a statue of themselves there. They had done all the work after all. The king said it, and the workers did it. In the 12th month, the time had come to transport all the wood, and the king invited everyone to the island for a week of festivities. The workers, who were already there, invited their families, distant relatives, and friends. Everyone celebrated the good times, and at the end of the week, the king addressed his people. He reminded them that his rule would soon come to an end, and that it had been a true honor to be their king. But nobody cheered. The crowd was silent. Grief-stricken, they returned to their homes on board of their hundreds and hundreds of brand new ships. A week later, the king woke up in his palace for the last time, and he said farewell to all the riches. When he came outside, servants waited for him, and they helped him on top of a giant elephant. Thousands of people followed him through the streets while their king waved at bystanders. They exited the city through the large main gate, and the procession went from village to village, all the way to the port, where the king dismounted the elephant and stepped on board of the ship that had saved his life exactly 1 year ago. People cried, and guards had to force many of them away from the ship. The king waved at them, smiling. The captain looked at him and pointed out that it was the first time he had seen a departing king smile. The ship set sail, and some time later it arrived at the island, where the king laid eyes on the port, the statue of himself, and all the other things that had been built there. Then he shook the captain's hand and gave back the royal robe. As he looked over the captain's shoulder, he could see on the far horizon hundreds and hundreds of brand new ships.